My name is Leo Morgan, and I am 71 years old. At my daughter's wedding, her fiancé taught me a lesson. I thought I'd already learned that humiliation tastes a lot like buttercream frosting and shattered pride. He shoved my face into a $7,000 cake in front of 300 people and called me a beggar. What he didn't know is that I owned the building they were standing in. Before I tell you how I settled that debt, please hit like and subscribe if you believe that respect is earned, not bought. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see how far a story of an old man's honor can travel. The wedding was held at the Azure Ballroom, a place so luxurious it felt like the air itself was gilded. I stood in a corner, a ghost in my old but well-pressed suit, watching a world I had built but no longer belonged to. The clinking of champagne glasses sounded like distant mocking bells. My daughter Chloe was a vision in white, but her smile was a fragile piece of glass I was afraid would break. Her fiancé, Preston Vanderbilt, moved through the crowd like a shark, all teeth and tailored perfection. Every so often his gaze would land on me, and it was the kind of look you give something you've stepped in. He saw a liability, a relic, an embarrassing old man who didn't fit into the glossy picture he was painting for himself. I saw the way he held my daughter's arm, not with affection, but with a sense of ownership, and a cold knot formed in my stomach. When the time came for the speeches, the MC called for the father of the bride. The spotlight found me in my corner, and a polite, hesitant applause rippled through the room. I walked to the stage, my old bones protesting slightly. I didn't have a long, flowery speech prepared. I just spoke from the heart. I talked about holding Chloe in my arms for the first time, about the fierce, consuming love a father has for his daughter. I wished her a life filled with laughter and kindness, and a partner who would cherish her a fraction as much as I did. I kept it short. When I finished, there was a quiet, genuine warmth in the applause. But then Preston stepped up to the microphone, clapping slowly, a theatrical, mocking rhythm. "Well said, Pops, a real tearjerker. Now let's get to the fun part." The fun part was the cake. It was a monstrous 7-tiered tower of white frosting and delicate sugar flowers. They cut the first slice together, a picture of manufactured bliss for the photographer. Then Preston took the plate. He turned not to Chloe, but to me. A wicked smirk played on his lips. "You look like you could use a good meal," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Before I could process his words, his hand shot out, grabbing the back of my head. The world became a blur of white. I felt the sickening crunch of the cake's structure giving way, the cold, greasy smear of frosting filling my nostrils, my mouth. The room erupted, not in gasps of shock, but in roars of laughter from Preston's friends. He pulled my head back, my face a grotesque mask of cream and crumbs. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper for all the nearby tables to hear. "Try some dessert, beggar." Silence. The laughter died as quickly as it had started, replaced by a thick, suffocating stillness. Chloe stood frozen, her face a canvas of horror and disbelief. In that moment of total, soul-crushing humiliation, a new sound cut through the air. It was a voice deep and resonant with undisguised fury. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Henry Harrison, a man whose name opened doors all over the country, was on his feet. He was one of the most powerful developers in the city, and a man Preston had been desperately trying to meet for months. Henry pointed a finger not at Preston, but at me. "That beggar is Leo Morgan," he boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous ballroom. "He founded Morgan Construction. He doesn't just own a few buildings, you arrogant little fool. He owns half the damn city, including the ground you're standing on." Preston's face went from smug to confused to utterly terrifyingly pale. The blood drained from his face as if a plug had been pulled, and in his eyes I saw the dawning horror of a man who had just realized his gravest miscalculation. "My name is Leo Morgan, and no, I am not a beggar. I am simply a man who grew tired of the lies that money tells. At 71, I have learned that a man's true worth isn't found in a bank statement. but in the calluses on his hands and the promises he keeps. It wasn't always this way. There was a time when the name Morgan was synonymous with concrete and steel, with skyscrapers that rose to challenge the sky itself. Morgan Construction wasn't just a company. It was my legacy built from nothing but two hands, a mind that never stopped calculating, and a heart that refused to accept failure. I ate, slept, and breathed blueprints, the roar of construction sites, and the thrill of multi-million-dollar deals. I had it all: a mansion that overlooked the entire city, a fleet of polished cars, and a seat at every exclusive club. But then Isabella, the love of my life, was taken from me. Cancer stole her piece by piece, and in the deafening silence of that enormous mansion, I was forced to face a bitter truth. All the towers I had built, all the zeros in my accounts, they couldn't fill the void she left behind. They were just cold, empty walls. The fortune I had amassed felt like a mountain of meaningless stones. So I made a choice. I sold everything. The mansion, the cars, the shares in dozens of ventures. I retained ownership of Morgan Construction, but I handed the reins to a board of directors I trusted. Then I retreated. I moved into the small timber house nestled by a lake. This wasn't just any house. It was the one I had built for Isabella with my own hands, the place we had planned to grow old together, where every beam and floorboard was soaked in the memory of her laughter. I began to live a different kind of life, a life where I defined its meaning, not society. People often confuse simplicity with poverty. They can't comprehend the profound joy of mending a broken fence yourself, or the deep peace of casting a fishing line into the water as the sun rises. They see an old man in a worn flannel shirt and they automatically fill in the blanks: failure has been pitiable. I let them think it. Because I learned long ago that great wealth is a magnet for opportunists, a perfect camouflage for the worst kind of character. And I wanted to protect my daughter Chloe from men like that. I thought that by stripping away the veneer of fortune, I could see who people really were. It was a test. A painful, naive test, as it turned out. But it was born from a father's desire to see his only child find a love as real as the one I had lost. I wanted her to find someone who saw the value in the man, not the wallet. That 15-year-old pickup truck, it's more a part of me than the expensive watches I used to wear. There's still a tiny scratch on the dashboard from the time Isabella dropped her wedding ring between the seats. We spent half an hour laughing our heads knocking together in the small cab as we searched for it. The passenger seat is worn in a particular way, molded to the shape of her from the thousands of miles we drove. Her hand always resting on my leg, her fingers tapping along to the old songs on the radio. Selling that truck would feel like evicting her ghost. And these old clothes, they are a map of a life well lived. This old leather jacket has a faint scar on the sleeve from a piece of rebar at the Liberty Tower site. I remember coming home that day, covered in dust, and Isabella just wiped my cheek and told me she was proud of the city I was building. This jacket was what I was wearing when we signed the papers for our first real home. These clothes are not signs of poverty. They are testaments. They are the medals of a long and happy campaign. I had always thought Chloe understood that. When she was a little girl, she loved riding in the old truck, her head barely clearing the window. She used to say it smelled like Dad. But then Preston Vanderbilt entered her life, and slowly, like a poison seeping into the soil, things began to change. The change was subtle at first, a slight shift in her tone. One Sunday she said to me, "Dad, some of my friends were asking, why don't you get a more respectable car?" The word respectable stung. It was the first time she had ever looked at my life through someone else's eyes and found it lacking. It was the first time she saw my memories not as treasures, but as junk. A small fissure appeared that day, a tiny crack in the foundation I thought we had built together. I didn't know it then, but it was just the beginning. The crack was about to get much, much wider. That wider crack appeared in the form of a bank transfer. It started as these things often do, with a small request. "Dad, I need about $200, Chloe said over the phone. There's a work event and I need a new dress. I gave it to her without a second thought. But a week later, it was another call. We need $5,000 for a deposit on a trip to Aspen. Preston says it's an incredible networking opportunity. The word choice struck me. We, not I. Preston had become a silent partner in her finances. The requests began to flow like water from a broken dam. It was never for rent or for groceries or for any real necessity. It was for the trappings of a life she was trying to buy into. $1,000 for a table at a charity gala where Preston wanted to be seen. $10,000 to help with the down payment on a new luxury sedan because, as she explained with an embarrassed stammer, Preston said her old Honda was humiliating. Each time I transferred the money, each time I felt a piece of my daughter slipping away. She thought she was draining my meager retirement savings one designer handbag at a time. I let her believe it. I was giving them rope waiting, hoping they would use it to climb, not to hang themselves. Preston, meanwhile, shed any pretense of respect. His contempt for me became a kind of sport. He'd walk into my home and make a show of wiping his feet as if he were entering a barn. "Still listening to that funeral music, Pops?" he'd ask, gesturing to my beloved jazz records. During family dinners, which became increasingly rare, he would interrupt my stories to boast about his stock portfolio, or to explain in condescending detail some new tech trend, as if I were a child. He wasn't just dismissive. He was actively trying to diminish me in my own daughter's eyes, to frame me as a relic, a doddering old fool whose opinions were as outdated as his pickup truck. He wasn't trying to win my approval. He was trying to make it irrelevant. I watched it all, and I stayed quiet. I saw the calculation in his eyes every time he looked at Chloe. He wasn't in love with my daughter. He was making an investment. He was acquiring a beautiful asset with what he believed was a promising future inheritance. And he treated me like an inconvenient clause in the contract, a bothersome detail that needed to be managed, tolerated, and eventually erased. The first real alarm bell, the kind you can't ignore, rang a few months before the wedding. Preston and his mother Diana summoned me for a meeting. They didn't come to my quiet lakeside home, of course. That would have been too much of an inconvenience. Instead, I was to meet them at their club, a place with dark wood paneling, suffocatingly thick carpets, and portraits of stern-faced men who all looked like they'd been born disappointed. The air was heavy with the smell of old money and decay. Chloe was there too, sitting silently beside Diana, looking small and anxious. Diana Vanderbilt was a woman who wore her pearls like armor. Her smile was a thin, bloodless line, and her eyes had the cold glint of a banker assessing a loan application. She slid a thick, leather-bound binder across the polished mahogany table. "Leo," she began, her voice smooth and condescending. "Preston and I have put together a preliminary vision for the wedding. We wanted your input, and it was a lie and we all knew it. This wasn't a request for input. It was a presentation of demands." Preston opened the binder with a flourish. Inside were glossy photos and pages of itemized costs that made my head spin. "We're starting with a baseline budget of $500,000, he announced as if discussing the weather. "We've secured the Azure Ballroom. The caterer is flying in salmon from Scotland. The champagne will be vintage French, naturally." Diana chimed in. "And we've arranged for a string quartet from Vienna to handle the music. Oh, and Chloe simply must have the dove release after the ceremony." I looked at my daughter, who was staring intently at her hands, avoiding my gaze. I couldn't see a single trace of her personality in this gaudy, extravagant fantasy. It was a wedding for strangers. This wasn't a celebration of love. It was a corporate merger, and they were planning the launch party. I let them finish. I nodded politely, turning the pages of their ridiculous binder. Then I closed it gently and pushed it back to the center of the table. "It's certainly elaborate," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I have another idea, a proposal as my wedding gift to you both." I leaned forward. "Let me host the wedding at the Grand Majestic Hotel." I saw a flicker of confusion in their eyes. As you know, I continued, my company spent 3 years restoring that landmark. We brought back the original gold leaf in the ballroom, imported marble from the same quarry in Italy that was used in 1928. It's a piece of this city's history. It's a piece of my history. I will cover everything. The venue, the food, the staff, my gift. No expense spared. My offer hung in the air, a genuine, heartfelt contribution from the core of my life's work. Diana was the first to break the silence. She let out a small, tinkling laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, Leo, that's quaint. Truly, a lovely little passion project. The word little was a dagger. But we are aiming for an atmosphere that's a bit more exclusive. The Azure has a certain prestige, you understand. Preston jumped in, eager to support his mother. Yeah, Pops, we appreciate the thought, really. But the Majestic is historic. It's old. We're going for modern, for something that feels fresh. Chloe's friends, our guests, they're used to a certain standard. They had dismissed my life's work, my legacy, as a quaint little project. They didn't see the value in history or craftsmanship. They only saw brand names and price tags. After gracefully rejecting my gift, Preston slid a single crisp sheet of paper across the table towards me. In any case, he said, his tone all business now, we've put together a short list of some of the more significant items we thought you might like to contribute to make it easier for you. I looked down. It wasn't a list of suggestions. It was an invoice. Floral arrangements, $40,000. Lighting and sound package, $25,000. Vintage champagne allotment, $30,000. I stared at the paper, then I looked up at my daughter. She was still looking down, her silence a complete surrender. And in that moment, I understood with perfect, chilling clarity. They didn't want a father-in-law. They didn't want my blessing or my heartfelt gifts. They wanted a sponsor, an ATM. And as I sat there in that cold, silent room, I realized I was no longer just watching a crack form. I was watching them take a sledgehammer to the entire foundation. A few weeks after the meeting at the club, a thick manila envelope arrived at my house by courier. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, addressed to Chloe but sent to my address. My hand trembled slightly as I held it. It felt cold, heavy, with a significance I already dreaded. I called Chloe and told her she had mail. She told me to just open it. It's probably just something from Preston's lawyers, she said, her tone casual, almost bored. He mentioned they'd be sending something over. So I opened it. The document inside was dense with the kind of language designed to confuse and intimidate, legalese stacked in thick, numbered paragraphs. But I hadn't built a billion-dollar company by being unable to read a contract. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Isabella and I had planned our entire lives, and I began to read. It was a prenuptial agreement, and it wasn't a shield to protect Preston's assets. It was a spear aimed directly at the heart of my family. Most of it was standard, clauses about separate property, debt liability. But then I got to Section C, subsection 4. My blood ran cold. The wording was slick, coiled like a snake in the grass, but the meaning was brutally clear. It stated that in the event of a divorce, Preston would be entitled to 50% of any and all gifts, inheritances, or windfalls received by Chloe during the course of their marriage. It wasn't about the money she had now. It was about the money he believed she would get when I died. He was preemptively raiding my grave. He had looked at my daughter, the most precious thing in my life, and seen nothing but a winning lottery ticket. I picked up the phone immediately. My voice was steady, but inside a storm was raging. Chloe, I said when she answered, I've read the agreement. There was a pause. Oh, okay, she said, a defensive edge already in her voice. Chloe, you cannot sign this, I said, trying to keep my tone calm, paternal. This isn't a normal prenup. This is a trap. The man is laying claim to your future, to money that isn't even on the table yet. He's planning for my death. Her response was not what I expected. There was no shock, no concern, only a cold, rehearsed anger. Preston explained it all to me, Dad. It's just a formality. His lawyers insisted on it to make sure everything is fair and balanced. Fair, I nearly shouted. Chloe, there is nothing fair about a man who wants half of what your dead father leaves you. Can't you see what this is? Then came the words that broke my heart. They weren't her words. They were his, placed carefully in her mouth. You know, Dad, Preston warned me you'd be like this. He said you'd try to find a problem with it. He said you don't trust my judgment. I was speechless. He had anticipated my reaction. He had already poisoned the well. He thinks you're trying to control me with your money, even the idea of it. She continued, her voice gaining a cruel confidence. This is about love and trust, not about finances. Our love is stronger than some piece of paper. I'm sorry you can't see that. This has nothing to do with love, sweetheart. I pleaded, my voice cracking. This is a business transaction for him. No, she snapped. It's a marriage, and I'm signing it. I love him, I trust him, and I would appreciate it if my own father would do the same. The line went dead. She had hung up on me. I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. I was holding a document that proved my future son-in-law was a predator. And I had just learned that my own daughter was willing to walk right into his trap, believing it was the path to happiness. He wasn't just after my fortune. He was stealing my daughter, one lie at a time. The final alarm, the one that signaled a full-blown invasion, didn't ring. It simply walked through my front door on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. Preston and Chloe showed up unannounced. Chloe had a nervous energy about her, a stark contrast to Preston, who strolled in with the breezy entitlement of a king returning to his castle. He wasn't a guest. He was an inspector. Pop's place is looking cozy, he said, his eyes scanning my living room with disdain. Cozy was his word for small and worthless. He was holding a glossy interior design magazine rolled up like a baton. Chloe and I had a few ideas we wanted to run by you. Little upgrades to increase the property value. I stood by the stone fireplace, the one I had built with my own hands, field stones chosen one by one from the lake shore with Isabella. Preston walked over and tapped it with his magazine. This whole thing is so dark and rustic, he declared. We'd tear this out first. Replace it with a clean white marble facade. Very minimalist. It would really open up the room. He moved on with Chloe trailing nervously behind him like a shadow. He strode into my study, my sanctuary filled with books that were like old friends. This room has great light, he said, looking past the shelves. Perfect for a Peloton room, maybe a small gym. Get some real energy flowing in here. Chloe offered a weak, "Oh, that's an idea." He didn't even acknowledge her. He was on a roll, a one-man demolition crew. In the kitchen, he ran a dismissive hand over the custom oak cabinets I had spent a month crafting. All this wood is so dated. We'll gut this whole space. Stainless steel quartz countertops, a wine fridge right here. I remained silent through it all. I felt like a ghost in my own home, a custodian of memories that were about to be bulldozed. They weren't just talking about changing a house. They were talking about erasing every last trace of the life I had built with my wife. They were planning to whitewash my history, to sterilize my memories. After they had mentally torn down every wall, they finally sat down on the sofa, and Chloe, prompted by a sharp look from Preston, began to speak. "Dad, we were thinking," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "After the wedding, things will be a little tight with all the expenses. We thought it might be best if we moved in here for a while." Preston immediately jumped in, framing it as an act of profound generosity. "Yeah, Pops. Just to help you out. You know, keep an eye on you. Make sure you're taking your meds and all that." He smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "And honestly, it'll help us save up for a proper place of our own. It's a win-win." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They were planning to spend $500,000 on a one-day party, but claimed they needed to save money by taking over my home. I waited for the other shoe to drop. It didn't take long. "And you don't have to worry about a thing," Preston continued smoothly, as if discussing the weather. "We've already started looking into some options for you. My mother has a connection at a very lovely retirement community just outside the city, Golden Meadows. I hear it has a fantastic golf course. You'd be much more comfortable there around people your own age." And there it was, the full, monstrous picture. They would take my home, the sanctuary I built for Isabella, and gut it. They would live here in the hollowed-out shell of my life. And I, the inconvenient old man, the walking, talking memory they wanted to forget, would be shipped off to a facility to wait quietly for the end. They weren't just being disrespectful anymore. They were handing me an eviction notice from my own life. I looked at the fireplace, at the sturdy stones I had set in place, and I felt a different kind of foundation settling inside me. Not of stone and mortar, but of cold, hard resolve. My patience had finally run out. The rehearsal dinner was the final act before the main event, and Preston had chosen the stage himself. It was a restaurant called Aperture, one of those places where the plates are enormous, the portions are tiny, and the bill is astronomical. The room he'd booked was private, but it felt cold and impersonal, all sharp angles, glass, and muted gray tones. It felt less like a family gathering and more like a corporate board meeting where a hostile takeover was about to be announced. I was seated at the far end of the long, sterile table, a deliberate act of marginalization. Chloe sat in the middle, a strained, brittle smile plastered on her face, laughing a little too loudly at things that weren't funny. Preston, of course, was at the head of the table holding court. He was in his element, a peacock displaying his feathers. He wasn't having a conversation. He was delivering a monologue. He regaled his captive audience with tales of his latest genius stock pick, a biotech firm that was guaranteed to triple in the next quarter. He casually mentioned a golf game he'd had with a senator, dropping the name with the subtlety of a falling anvil. He described their planned honeymoon, a 2-month affair involving a private yacht in the Mediterranean and a safari in Tanzania, as if he were discussing a trip to the grocery store. His parents, Diana, and her silent, perpetually unimpressed husband, listened with rapturous pride, nodding and adding their own affirmations of his brilliance. I just sat there, swirling the overpriced wine in my glass, a silent observer. I watched my daughter try to keep up her eyes, darting between Preston and me, a desperate plea for approval in them. At one point, Preston looked down the table at me and smirked. "We were just talking about building a legacy, Pops," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's all about forward momentum. You can't just rest on your laurels, you know. You have to keep building." The insult was clear. My quiet life, my choice to step away, was in his world a form of failure. I didn't respond. I just took a sip of wine and held his gaze. I let the silence hang there, a small act of defiance. The air crackled with unspoken tension. I knew this was just the overture. The main performance was yet to come. After the appetizers were cleared, Preston stood up, tapping his glass with a fork. A hush fell over the room. He held his champagne flute aloft, a practiced, confident gesture. "I'd just like to say a few words," he began, his voice oozing a false sincerity that made my skin crawl. "Thank you all for being here. This is a special night, a joining of 2 families, the Morgans and the Vanderbilts." He paused for effect, letting the weight of his family name hang in the air. "When you get married, you're not just getting a spouse. You're getting a whole new history, a new legacy. And tonight, I wanted to share a little story about my future father-in-law, Leo, a story that I think perfectly captures the unique spirit he's bringing to our family." A few of his friends chuckled expectantly. I braced myself. I knew this wasn't going to be a tribute. It was going to be an execution. As he prepared to speak, my mind flashed back to what really happened a few weeks prior. The memory was simple, clear, and unadorned. My phone had rung late on a Thursday afternoon. It was Preston, his voice tight with a panic he was trying to conceal. "Pops, hey. Got a bit of a problem. My car, it's got a flat. I'm out on Old Mill Road." I knew the road well. It was a deserted stretch of country asphalt with no shoulder and even worse, cell service. "Do you know how to change a tire?" I had asked him. There was a long pause. "Theoretically," he'd admitted. "But this is a German car. It's complicated." I sighed. "Stay put. I'm on my way." I threw my old hydraulic jack and my steel lug wrench in the back of my pickup and drove out. I found him standing helplessly beside his gleaming $200,000 sports car, looking at the flat tire as if it were an alien creature. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my truck. I got out, didn't say a word, and got to work. I had the car jacked up, the flat tire off, and the spare donut on in under 10 minutes. He stood by watching, careful not to get his hands dirty. When I was done, I tossed the flat in the back of my truck to take to the shop for him. He'd clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Thanks, Pops. You're a real lifesaver." It was a simple, mundane event, a moment where one family member helped another. That was the truth. But the truth was not what Preston was interested in. So there I was. Preston began his tale, his voice now theatrical, on my way to a major charity board meeting. Running late, of course, because every second counts, and boom, I hit something in the road and the tire just blows. I'm talking a complete blowout. I pull over and I'm thinking, great, just what I need. He shook his head, playing the part of the put-upon executive. So I make a call. Who better to help than my future father-in-law, the famous builder, right? A man who knows his way around tools. He paused, a smirk playing on his lips. Well, about 45 minutes later, I hear this noise, a chugging, sputtering sound. And over the hill comes this old pickup truck trailing a cloud of blue smoke. I swear I thought it was going to fall apart right there on the road. His friends roared with laughter. I saw Chloe force a smile, her knuckles white as she gripped her wineglass. So Pops gets out. Preston continued, his voice dripping with mock affection. And he pulls out this rusty old toolbox that looks like it was salvaged from the Titanic. He kneels down by the tire and starts fumbling around. First, he can't seem to find the right size wrench. Then, when he finally gets it on a lug nut, he starts turning it the wrong way. He mimed the motion, grunting and straining for comedic effect. I'm standing there trying to be patient, and I'm like, "Pops, it's righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. Basic mechanics, you know." The laughter grew louder. He finally gets the nuts off, and then comes the jack. Oh, the jack. Preston put his head in his hands as if reliving a great trauma. He slides this rickety old thing under the car and starts pumping. The car goes up, but it's wobbling like a newborn deer. I literally had to jump in and hold the car steady myself. I had visions of my $200,000 machine crashing down onto the asphalt. My life flashed before my eyes. This was pure fiction, every word a deliberate, malicious lie. But he told it with such conviction. He gets the tire off, finally covered in grease from head to toe. He looked like a raccoon. It was actually kind of adorable. He looked directly at me, then a triumphant gleam in his eye. But you know what? We got it done. It took the better part of an hour, a lot of deep breaths and some gentle coaching from yours truly. But we got there in the end. It was a real bonding moment. He raised his glass to me. It really taught me the value of patience when it comes to our elders. So let's hear it for Pops, a man who proves that it's never too late to learn a new trick, even if you need a little help. The room erupted in applause and laughter. It was a masterclass in humiliation delivered with a smile. I looked across the table at Chloe. She was clapping along, a pained, hollow look in her eyes, refusing to meet my gaze. That was it. That was the moment. Her silence was louder than all their laughter. It was the sound of her final, complete betrayal. And in that instant, something inside me shifted. The warmth I held for my daughter, the patient hope that she would see the truth, it all just froze. It solidified into something cold, hard, and unbreakable. The sadness vanished, and in its place was a profound, chilling clarity. The man I was a minute ago, the loving father, the patient old man, he died right there at that table. And in his place someone else was born. A man who had built an empire from nothing. A man who understood foundations. And a man who knew with absolute certainty that the entire structure in front of him was rotten to the core and needed to be brought down. The laughter from his twisted story finally began to subside, but Preston held up a hand, a gesture that said, "I'm not finished." A self-satisfied, almost benevolent smile spread across his face. "But that little adventure on the road," he said, his voice taking on a serious, thoughtful tone, "it wasn't just a funny story. It was a wake-up call. It taught me that our responsibility to our family doesn't end when we grow up. In fact, that's when it truly begins." He looked around the table, making eye contact with his parents, then with Chloe. He was setting the stage, positioning himself as the noble, responsible son. "Chloe and I have been talking a lot lately," he continued, placing a hand over my daughter's. She flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, "and we've been worried. We've been worried about you, Dad. All alone out there in that big house by the lake. It's a lot for one person to manage. The upkeep, the isolation. We want you to have companionship. We want you to be safe, to have professional care available if you ever need it." He paused, letting the feigned concern sink in. "We want you to be able to truly relax and enjoy your golden years without a single worry in the world." He then turned to me, his eyes shining with a sickening, manufactured sincerity. "So as our special gift to you, to show you how much we love you and want to welcome you into our new life together, we've taken care of everything." He beamed as if he were about to present me with a winning lottery ticket. "We've secured a spot for you at one of the finest retirement communities in the state. It's called Golden Meadows. It's more like a country club, really. It has a championship golf course, a heated indoor pool, gourmet dining, and a full schedule of social activities. You'll be around people your own age, making new friends. It's all arranged. You can move in right after our honeymoon." The room was silent for a beat, and then it erupted. Not with gasps, but with applause. A genuine, heartfelt round of applause. Diana Preston's mother brought a hand to her chest, dabbing at a non-existent tear. "Oh, Preston," she cooed. "You have such a big, generous heart. What a wonderful son." Their friends murmured their agreement. "How thoughtful. What a relief for him, I'm sure." They were congratulating him for his kindness, for his filial piety. They were applauding him for orchestrating my exile, for cleverly and kindly disposing of the inconvenient old man. I didn't look at them. I didn't hear them. My entire world had narrowed to a single point at the center of the table, my daughter. I watched Chloe. She wasn't clapping, but she wasn't protesting either. Her head was bowed, her gaze fixed on the intricate pattern of her dinner plate, as if it held the secrets of the universe. Her shoulders were slumped in surrender. A weak, pathetic smile was frozen on her lips. She would not look at me. She could not look at me. Because she knew what this was, and her silence was her signature on my eviction notice. Her silence was her consent. That was the final blow. The story about the tire was a humiliation. This was an assassination of my life. They weren't just disrespecting my past. They were foreclosing on my future. They had discussed and decided upon the final chapter of my life without consulting me, as if I were a piece of property to be managed. In their perfect modern world, I was just a loose end, and they had just tied me in a neat little bow ready to be discarded. I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just the quiet, absolute certainty of a building inspector condemning a structure that was rotten to its very foundation. The decision was made. The war had begun. I sat there amidst the applause, a statue at the center of a feast. The sounds of the room seemed to warp and fade, the clinking of glasses and the cheerful chatter becoming a distant, meaningless hum. I felt a strange and profound stillness settle over me, a calm so deep it was almost terrifying. It wasn't the numbness of shock or the dull ache of sadness. It was the absolute quiet that comes after a building collapses, when the dust is still hanging in the air and the final shape of the destruction is made clear. In that moment, I saw everything with a perfect crystalline clarity. I saw the depth of their greed, the totality of their disrespect. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't youthful arrogance. This was a calculated, methodical plan to erase me. I looked at Preston, flushed with victory, and I didn't see a fool. I saw an enemy. I looked at my daughter, her head still bowed in silent complicity, and I didn't see a victim. I saw an accomplice. The part of my heart that had held out hope for her, that had made excuses for her, simply turned to stone. The patient father was gone. The architect remained. And he knew with the certainty of a surveyor studying a map exactly what had to be done. I drove home from the rehearsal dinner in a state of profound calm. The city lights blurred past my window, but I saw none of them. My mind was a quiet, orderly room where all the furniture had finally been put in its proper place. The pain, the confusion, the lingering hope, it had all been swept away, leaving behind only the cold, clean floor of purpose. I didn't go to the living room or the kitchen. I walked straight to my study, the room they had so casually slated for demolition to make way for an exercise bike. I sat down behind my old oak desk, the one I'd used for 40 years, to sign contracts that built skylines. The solid, familiar wood felt like an anchor in a churning sea. For a long time, I just sat there in the dark, the scent of old books and leather around me like a comforting shroud. I wasn't grieving anymore. Grief is a chaotic, messy emotion. This was different. This was the quiet focus of an architect reviewing a flawed blueprint just before a controlled demolition. I had spent years of my life building things to last: buildings, a company, a family. I had always believed that a strong foundation could withstand any storm. But I had made a critical error. I had mistaken my daughter's love for a foundation, when in fact it had become a weather vane spinning uselessly in whatever direction Preston's hot air was blowing. The love for my child was still there, of course, buried deep beneath layers of disappointment and resolve. But it was no longer the guiding principle. A colder, more pragmatic duty had taken its place. A duty to the legacy I had built with Isabella. A duty to the very concept of integrity, which was now under direct assault. This wasn't about punishing my daughter. It was about teaching her a lesson about value that she had tragically unlearned. A lesson that would be severe, yes, but also necessary. My hand felt steady as I reached for the old landline telephone on my desk. I didn't need to look up the number. I dialed it from a memory etched in stone. It rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Evelyn Reed?" "Evelyn," I said, my voice quiet but clear in the silent room. "It's Leo." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Leo, it's after midnight. Is everything all right?" I looked out the window at the dark, still water of the lake. "Everything," I said slowly, "is exactly as we predicted it might be one day." I let the weight of that sentence settle between us. Then I gave the order. "Activate the sunset protocol." There was no hesitation in her voice, no questions, only the calm, immediate acceptance of a trusted ally. "Understood, Leo," she replied. "I'll set the wheels in motion first thing in the morning." The line clicked. The call was over. I placed the receiver back in its cradle. The sound was soft, but in the stillness of the night, it felt like the thunderous clang of a great lever being pulled, setting a vast and powerful machine long dormant into unstoppable motion. The sunset protocol. It sounds like something out of a spy movie, doesn't it? But it's nothing so glamorous. It's simply a plan. A blueprint for the end of a life designed by a man who spent his entire career ensuring his buildings would never crumble. I just decided to apply the same principles to my legacy. After Isabella died, I was adrift. The silence in our big house was a physical presence, and my fortune felt like a curse, a giant target painted on my back. I saw what happened to other men of my generation. I saw their children and their new spouses circling like vultures, their grief barely concealing their impatience for the reading of the will. I saw their legacies squandered on fast cars and foolish ventures. I would not allow that to happen to what Isabella and I had built. Our life's work was meant to create, not to be consumed by greed. So I called Evelyn Reed. Evelyn has been my lawyer for over 30 years. She's sharper than a shard of glass and has a spine made of pure steel. We sat in my study for a week with financial planners and trust experts, and we built a fortress. Not a fortress of walls and gates, but of paper and law. We called it the Sunset Protocol. The first principle was insulation. My personal wealth, the kind someone could look up in a public record, was reduced to almost nothing. The billions, the controlling interest in Morgan Construction, the vast real estate portfolio, the stock holdings, all of it was transferred into a series of carefully constructed, irrevocable trusts. The primary entity is the Isabella Morgan Legacy Trust. It is a legal ghost and invisible giant. That trust is the true owner of everything. I, Leo Morgan, am merely a beneficiary, and the trust's primary steward. The second principle was observation. My new life, my simple life, was the core of the protocol. I wasn't pretending to be poor. In a legal sense, I was living on a fixed income. The trust pays me a generous stipend enough to live comfortably for 100 lifetimes. But it is a stipend, not an endless well. This modest lifestyle became my character filter. It was designed to test anyone who came into my life, especially anyone who wanted to marry my daughter. Would they see a man, a father, with a lifetime of experience and love to offer? Or would they see a nearly empty bank account? An old man whose only remaining value was the inheritance he would one day leave behind. Preston wasn't the first man Chloe had dated since I enacted the protocol, but he was the first to fail the test so spectacularly, so utterly. He didn't just fail. He set the test on fire. The final principle was activation. The protocol was designed to be dormant, a silent guardian. Activating it, as I did with my call to Evelyn, meant switching from a passive defensive posture to an active offensive one. Activating it meant that Evelyn and her team were now authorized to use the full, formidable resources of the trust to investigate and neutralize any threat. It meant the gloves came off. When Preston's lawyers sent that prenuptial agreement, Evelyn's office flagged it immediately. That was the first hostile act. My call simply gave her the green light to respond in kind. Activation means a team of forensic accountants, the best in the business, began a deep dive into the Vanderbilt family's finances. It's why we knew they were on the brink of bankruptcy. It means a team of private investigators began looking into Preston's life, his business dealings, his character. It means every legal document, every interaction, was now being analyzed as evidence in a war I had not started, but that I fully intended to finish. The name Sunset Protocol was Evelyn's idea. She said it was because it was a plan for the sunset of my life, a way to ensure that when my sun finally did set its light, would continue to shine on the things that mattered, on charity, on community, on the legacy of the woman I loved, and not be lost in the greedy darkness that was attempting to swallow my family whole. What Preston and Chloe didn't understand is that you can't cheat a man who has spent his life reading the fine print. You can't con a man who drew the blueprints for the entire game. They thought they were dealing with a frail old man in a small house. They had no idea they were trying to demolish a skyscraper with a couple of toy hammers. The protocol was the foundation, and I was about to show them what happens when you mistake a bedrock of granite for a patch of soft dirt. After the call with Evelyn, there was one more piece to put in place. This wasn't a call to a lawyer. It was a call to a brother in arms. Henry Harrison and I had been through the trenches together for 40 years. We started out as rivals, two young, hungry developers trying to carve out a piece of the city for ourselves. But over decades of brutal competition, we forged a deep and abiding respect for one another, which eventually blossomed into a rare and powerful friendship. Henry was one of the few people left on this earth who knew the man. I was not just the legend or the balance sheet. He knew my love for Isabella, my pride in my work, and my quiet contempt for the new breed of slick, empty suits that had taken over our world. I dialed his private number. He answered on the second ring, his voice a familiar gravelly bark. "This better be good, Leo. You woke me up from a very expensive dream." "Henry, it's me," I said, forgoing any pleasantries. "I'm calling in a marker." The humor vanished from his voice instantly. In 40 years, I had never once asked him for a favor. He knew this was not a casual call. "What is it? What's wrong? I need you to tell me what you know about the Vanderbilt family," I said. I could hear him sit up in bed. The Vanderbilts, a clan of peacocks with moth-eaten feathers. Their grandfather made a fortune in shipping, their father squandered most of it on bad art, and worse racehorses, and the current heir. Preston is a walking billboard for cheap cologne and desperation. They've been leveraged to the hilt for years, borrowing against a reputation they no longer own. "Why are you asking about those clowns?" "Because their heir is marrying my daughter tomorrow," I said quietly. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. When Henry spoke again, his voice was low and dangerous. "Leo, what has he done?" So I told him. I told him everything. The constant demands for money. The prenuptial agreement designed to raid my estate. The plans to gut the house Isabella and I had built. And finally, I told him about the rehearsal dinner. I recounted Preston's story about the flat tire and the grand magnanimous gift of a one-way ticket to a retirement home. I didn't inject any emotion into the telling. I simply laid out the facts one after another, like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a grand jury. When I finished, Henry was breathing heavily into the phone. He didn't offer sympathy or condolences. He offered something far better, pure, unadulterated rage on my behalf. "That arrogant little parasite," he snarled. "He's going to dispose of Leo Morgan." The man who practically invented the modern skyline while his own father was figuring out new ways to declare bankruptcy. The absolute audacity of that boy. He paused, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his sharp mind. "All right, Leo. The battle lines are drawn. What's the order? What do you need from me?" This was why I had called him. No hesitation, no questions, just immediate unconditional loyalty. "I need you at the wedding tomorrow, Henry," I said. "I need you to sit there, and I need you to watch. And when you see the signal, I need you to stand up and make a scene." "A scene?" He asked, a hint of dark amusement in his voice. "Yes," I confirmed. "I need you to remind that room full of fools and sycophants exactly who they're dealing with. I need you to detonate a truth bomb right in the middle of their champagne reception." I heard a low chuckle from Henry's end of the line. "Leo," he said, his voice filled with a grim satisfaction. "It will be my absolute pleasure. Just tell me when." After the calls were made and the pieces were set in motion, I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I didn't feel anger or even satisfaction. I just felt a profound and heavy sense of duty. I swiveled my chair around to face the bookshelves that lined the wall. My fingers traced the spines of old books, their pages filled with stories of honor, tragedy, and redemption. But my eyes settled on a small silver frame that stood between a collection of poetry and a stack of architectural journals. It was a photograph of Isabella. It was taken on the day we broke ground on our first major project, the building that would put Morgan Construction on the map. She was standing in a muddy field wearing my oversized hard hat, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and a smile that could have outshone the sun. In her eyes was a belief in me that was so absolute, so unwavering, it became the foundation upon which I built everything. We had nothing then but a risky idea and a mountain of debt, but we were the richest we had ever been. I picked up the frame, my thumb stroking the cool glass over her smiling face. "What would you think of all this, Izzy?" I whispered into the quiet room. "You always saw the good in everyone. You would have told me to be patient with Chloe. You would have said she's just lost her way." For a moment, a wave of grief and doubt washed over me. Was I being too harsh? Was I about to destroy my own daughter's life to settle a score? But as I looked at her picture, I knew the answer. Isabella was kind, but she was not weak. She had a fierce, unshakable sense of right and wrong. She despised bullies and cheats, and she had no tolerance for those who valued money over people. She would have been heartbroken by what Chloe had become, but she would have been utterly disgusted by Preston. She would never have stood by and allowed a parasite to feast on the life we had so painstakingly built. This was never about the money. Preston and Chloe could have had the money. If they had come to me with respect, with honesty, with a genuine plan to build a life together, I would have given them everything they needed. But they didn't want to build. They wanted to take. They saw my life's work not as a legacy of hard work and sacrifice, but as a vault to be cracked open. They looked at the home I built with my own hands as a piece of real estate to be flipped. They looked at me not as a father, but as an obstacle. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy, emotional act. This was an audit. It was a correction. It was about restoring balance and defending the very principles our family was built on, that dignity is not for sale, that respect is earned, not inherited, and that love is about what you are willing to give, not what you are determined to take. I placed the photograph back on the shelf, my resolve hardening from a liquid state into solid steel. I was not doing this for myself. I was doing this for Isabella. I was defending her memory from the cheap, gaudy world that was trying to claim it. I was protecting our daughter from the worst parts of herself, from the hollow man who had so completely captured her. The lesson would be painful, of that there was no doubt. But some structures are so rotted, so compromised, that they cannot be repaired. They must be torn down to the foundation and built anew. The storm was coming, and I, Leo Morgan, would be the architect of the flood. Henry's words dropped into the silent ballroom like a boulder into a placid pond. The ripples of shock spread instantly. A low murmur erupted, growing into a wave of whispers and frantic glances. 300 pairs of eyes, which moments ago had been looking at me with a mixture of pity and amusement, now swiveled to stare at Preston with a new hungry curiosity. They were no longer looking at the charming, successful groom. They were looking at a fraud. Preston stood frozen, the blood having completely drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, waxy white. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at Henry, then at me, his eyes wide with a dawning animal panic. He tried to laugh, a choked, strangled sound that died in his throat. That's a joke, right?" he stammered, looking around for support. "A very funny, very expensive joke. Pops tell them." But I wasn't Pops anymore. While all eyes were on him, I moved with a slow, deliberate grace that had been absent for years. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a clean white handkerchief, one of Isabella's old monograms still visible in the corner. I did not rush. I did not show any emotion. I began to methodically wipe the sticky, sweet mess of the cake from my face. I cleaned my eyebrows. I cleared the frosting from my nostrils. I wiped my lips. Each movement was precise, economical, and calm. The frail, slightly stooped posture of the 71-year-old man was gone. I stood straighter, my shoulders squared. The look in my eyes, which had been one of pained humiliation, was now one of cold, dispassionate assessment. I was no longer the victim in this drama. I was the director, and the final act was just beginning. The man who had stumbled to the stage to give a heartfelt speech had been replaced by the man who had faced down union bosses, corrupt city officials, and ruthless competitors for 40 years and had never lost. Preston saw the change in me. The sight of my cold composure seemed to terrify him more than Henry's outburst. His own composure shattered completely. "He's lying!" Preston finally shrieked, his voice cracking, pointing a trembling finger at Henry. "He's a senile old man, and so is this one," he yelled, gesturing wildly at me. "He's a broke, pathetic old fool who lives in a shack. Tell them, Chloe. Tell them all, he's lying." But Chloe was silent, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. I finished wiping my face and neatly folded the soiled handkerchief, placing it back in my pocket. I then looked Preston directly in the eye. My voice, when I finally spoke, was not loud, but it cut through his panicked shrieks like a razor, silencing the entire room. "Preston," I said, my tone level and dangerously calm, "it appears you have made a rather significant miscalculation." Just as Preston's frantic denial reached a fever pitch, the grand double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A woman stepped inside. She wasn't loud or flashy, but her presence had an immediate silencing effect on the room. This was Evelyn Reed. She was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, her silver hair cut in a sharp modern style. She carried a slim leather portfolio, and her movements were crisp and efficient, devoid of any wasted motion. She didn't hurry. She walked down the center aisle with a steady, measured pace, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She wasn't a guest. That much was obvious. She radiated an aura of pure, undiluted authority. The chaotic, gossiping energy of the room seemed to retract as she approached, as if a queen had just entered her court. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent behind a pair of minimalist glasses, scanned the scene. Preston's panicked face, Chloe's collapsed form, Henry's defiant stance, and finally me. She gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a confirmation, a signal that the next phase was beginning. She stopped beside me, facing the stunned wedding party. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried an inherent power that cut through the remaining whispers. "Good evening," she said, her tone cool and professional. "My name is Evelyn Reed. I am legal counsel for Mr. Leo Morgan." She placed her portfolio on a nearby table and opened it. "I apologize for the interruption. I have just a few brief points of clarification to present." The balance of power in the room had not just shifted. It had been completely and irrevocably overturned. Evelyn gave a slight nod to a technician at the side of the room, and the large projector screen behind the wedding cake, which had been displaying a romantic slideshow of Chloe and Preston, flickered to life. The photos were replaced by a crisp, clear image of a legal document. It was a deed of ownership. A collective gasp went through the room. "Let's begin with our current location," Evelyn said, her voice calm and steady. "The Azure Ballroom, a fine establishment, very prestigious, very expensive." She used a small laser pointer to highlight the owner's name on the document. The name was not a person, but a corporation, Isabella Holdings, LLC. Isabella Holdings, Evelyn explained, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Isabella Morgan Legacy Trust, established by Mr. Morgan 10 years ago. She let that information hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "This means that every single dollar spent on this event, from the Scottish salmon and Mr. Vanderbilt was so proud of, to the vintage champagne, to the $7,000 cake that now decorates my client's face, was paid for by Mr. Morgan." The silence in the room was now absolute. Preston stared at the screen as if it were a death warrant. "Mr. Morgan did not offer to contribute to this wedding," Evelyn continued, her voice sharp as a scalpel. "He funded the entire affair from start to finish through a discretionary account he controls. He wanted to see what kind of event you would plan if given an unlimited budget. He wanted to measure the depths of your avarice and your vanity. I must say, the results are even more spectacular than we anticipated." She turned her gaze from the screen to Preston. "You are not a guest of honor in a grand ballroom, Mr. Vanderbilt. You are a lab rat in a very expensive cage, and you have just failed the experiment in the most dramatic fashion imaginable." The words landed like hammer blows, each one shattering the carefully constructed facade of Preston's life. He wasn't a powerful groom hosting a lavish party. He was a charity case, a fool who had just performed his own humiliation on a stage paid for by the very man he sought to destroy. The image on the screen changed. The deed was gone, replaced by a complex financial chart filled with columns of red numbers. It was a consolidated balance sheet. At the top, in bold letters, it read, Vanderbilt Family Holdings, Financial Overview. Which brings us to the motive, Evelyn said, her tone shifting from informative to prosecutorial. One might ask why a young man would go to such lengths to marry into a family he clearly despises. The answer, as it so often is desperation. Her laser pointer danced across the screen, highlighting key figures. This is a summary of your family's financial situation, Preston, compiled by our forensic accounting team. It shows over $27 million in outstanding debt. It shows 3 of your father's properties mortgaged to their absolute limit. It shows a credit line that has been frozen due to non-payment and a portfolio of stocks that has underperformed the market for 12 consecutive quarters. Diana Vanderbilt let out a strangled cry, her face ashen. Her husband looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. You are not old money, Mr. Vanderbilt. Evelyn stated the words cold and precise. You are the children of old money. There is a significant difference. You are the final withered branch of a once mighty tree, and you are drowning in debt. This wedding, this entire charade, was not a celebration of love. It was a desperate last-ditch attempt at a corporate bailout. You were not marrying Chloe Morgan. You were attempting a hostile takeover of her future. Evelyn clicked a button, and a new slide appeared, showing copies of loan applications Preston had recently filed, all of them rejected. You needed this. You believed that by marrying the daughter of the broke Leo Morgan, you would gain access to a future inheritance that would solve all your problems. You were betting on my client's death to save you from your own financial incompetence. Finally, the screen changed one last time. It now displayed a copy of the prenuptial agreement Chloe had signed. A huge red stamp was superimposed over the text, void. And that brings us to the final piece of your failed plan, Evelyn said, looking directly at Preston. This document, a rather predatory piece of legal work designed to grant you 50% of any future inheritance. There are 2 problems with it. She held up a single finger. First, under state law, a prenuptial agreement can be rendered void if it is proven to be unconscionable, or if it was signed based on fraudulent misrepresentation of one's own financial status. Given that you presented yourself as a wealthy scion instead of a man on the verge of bankruptcy, I believe we have a very strong case for the latter. She then held up a second finger. But more importantly, and far more simply, this contract is worthless because the asset it targets does not exist. She gestured back to the screen. Mr. Morgan's home, the small house you so generously planned to renovate after shipping him off to Golden Meadows, was placed into the Isabella Morgan Legacy Trust a decade ago. It has never been his personal property to bequeath. A new document appeared on the screen, a trust directive. Evelyn highlighted the key clause. Upon Mr. Morgan's passing, the property and the land it sits on are to be immediately and irrevocably donated to the state's leading children's hospital to be used as a therapeutic retreat for terminally ill children and their families. Evelyn lowered the laser pointer. There is no house to inherit Preston. There is no multi-million-dollar property to seize. There is no inheritance. The vault you tried so hard to crack has been empty all along. The final revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. The first to break was Diana. A strangled, animalistic sound escaped her throat before her eyes rolled back in her head and she collapsed sideways in her chair, a cascade of pearls and shattered dignity. Her husband, a man who had remained silent and invisible all evening, simply folded in on himself. He didn't faint. He just crumpled, burying his face in his hands, like a child trying to hide from a monster. Preston himself made no sound. He simply stared at the final slide on the screen, his dream of salvation turning to ash before his eyes. Then he sank to his knees, not with a crash, but with a slow, boneless descent, a puppet whose strings had just been cut. The Vanderbilt dynasty had not ended with a bang, but with a silent, pathetic whimper. With the Vanderbilt family in ruins, a mess of their own, making my attention turn to the final piece of wreckage, my daughter. I walked over to where Chloe was still sitting, her body racked with sobs. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lecture her. The time for that was long past. I spoke quietly, my voice devoid of the warmth it once held for her, replaced by the cold, hard finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "This man did not love you, Chloe." I said, my voice low and steady. "He loved an illusion of wealth he thought you represented. The choice of what to do now is yours. You can stay with this hollow man. But my name, my legacy, and my support will never be a part of that life. You have chosen his values over ours. Now you must live with them." I looked at her, my daughter, a stranger with a familiar face. "If you ever find your way back to the principles you were raised with, you know where I live. But the door will only open to the daughter I remember, not the woman I see before me now." I turned away from her, my business in this place concluded. I caught Evelyn's eye across the room. "Evelyn," I instructed, my voice clear and firm, "please ensure that every member of the staff here tonight, the waiters, the valets, the musicians, receives a bonus equivalent to double their salary for the evening. As for the remaining budget allocated for this event, transfer every last cent to the Isabella Morgan Memorial Fund at the Children's Hospital. Do it first thing in the morning." This spectacle of greed would fund a year of compassionate care. That felt right. That felt like a fitting end. I didn't look back. I walked towards the grand doors, my back straight, leaving the wreckage of the wedding behind me. Henry Harrison fell into step beside me, clapping a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. We stepped out into the cool night air, the sounds of chaos fading behind us. Henry let out a long, slow breath. "Well, Leo," he said with a grim smile, "I have to admit, that was infinitely more satisfying than a hostile takeover." I couldn't help but let a small, weary smile touch my own lips. Several months have passed since that night. I am sitting on the porch of my house by the lake, a cup of hot coffee warming my hands as I watch the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and rose. The birds are singing. The air is clean. I have found a quiet peace. The back door creaks open behind me. It's Chloe. She is alone. She looks thinner, and the expensive, empty facade she used to wear is gone. In her eyes, I see not a trace of entitlement, only a deep, profound, and fragile flicker of remorse. Our story is not over, but a new chapter has begun. This time it will be built on a foundation of truth. This time it will be built on my terms. This whole experience taught me a difficult but necessary lesson. True wealth is not measured by the size of your bank account, but by the strength of your integrity. For years, I thought patience was the ultimate form of love, but I learned that sometimes the most loving act is to create a painful conflict to protect the very values your family has forgotten. It's about defending a legacy of dignity, not just a legacy of dollars. Strength isn't about how much you can silently endure, but about having the courage to demand respect, even if it means tearing everything down to build it anew. Tell me in the comments, when is it right to stop being patient and start fighting back?